Thank you. I think I need to clarify something about my abstract first. I think in my abstract I said that the Philippines denied the export of labor, but it was actually the other way, as we will see. I just don't want there to be any surprises, so I apologize for that. So what I'm talking about today is pretty much completely unrelated to my actual research in history. This is a side interest of mine. It's kind of something I started thinking about in geography course I took last year with Belinda. I'm not sure if she's here. I don't see her. There she is, yes. So this is kind of something I started thinking about then. But my research deals with Filipino immigration to Winnipeg. And this is actually a result of my overall interest in Filipino global migration, and in particular, labor migration. So one of the things that I'm interested in and that I can justify the intersection between these two topics is when we talk about immigration, especially Canadian immigration, we're often talking about what happens after they arrive at the border. What experiences do they have? What's their experiences, once they land, and of their children? And these are all great questions. But I've always been interested in what happens on the other side of this, from the sending countries. So when we talk about global domestic labor, and this is what I'm interested in today, is domestic labor migration. We often think of racialized women from the global south who leave a country with a poor economic standard in an attempt to find some meaningful work, some meaningful source of income. Through remittances and the easing of social pressure, which is caused by systematic and underemployment in their home country, the domestic labor migration often benefits the sending state. Additionally, the receiving state and those who hire the domestics will benefit from a cheap and temporary labor force, which cannot claim much in terms of rights. In this context specifically, the Philippine state excels as one of the best models of the labor brokerage state. While today I am discussing foreign relations and government policy, the lived experiences of these workers are always in the back of my mind. Analyses of this scale are merited, I believe, by the direct impact that they do have on the lives of these migrants. This presentation will briefly overview the Philippine labor brokerage state, and in particular the accusation that is often made that the Philippine state migratory apparatus, which I'll refer to as the SMA, is more interested in facilitating the movement of laboring Filipino bodies than it is in protecting their rights while they are abroad. Now, one of the critiques of this kind of a system is that if the SMA, the Philippine SMA, does push too hard for the rights of their workers, the receiving countries are just going to close their borders and say, well, you want more money, you can't come, and we're going to go somewhere else. But in this case, I'm a bit of an optimist, if we can use that word for domestic labor migration, because I believe that there's some hope for a more equitable system in which the Philippines can leverage the rights of their citizens that are abroad more effectively. To explore this possibility, I'm going to be exploring a case that occurred in 2011 between the Philippines and Saudi Arabia. In this case, the Philippines did in fact try to leverage for the rights of their workers. And this also happened to occur at the same time that Indonesia was doing the same, because they also are a very significant source of domestic workers. And Saudi Arabia pretty much said, well, we're changing our policy. We're adopting a policy of Saudiization in which most employers were required to hire locals. And pretty much they were saying, we're not issuing any more visas, so you can't come. You want to play like that, forget about it. Now, what makes this case unique is that this was relatively short-lived. It was a 15-month little spat between the Philippines and Saudi. And in the end, the Philippines ended up getting their way for the most part. And this is a result of the Philippine SMA, as we will see. closing the market to the Filipino domestics created a shortage that the Saudi labor market could not fulfill. SMA is the state migratory apparatus. So I'll discuss that a little later, but it's the government agencies that help facilitate this, yeah. So as we see up there. Economic models frame labor migration differently. At the micro level, notions such as individual economic rationality suggest that the individual will choose the easiest route to economic gain, while more macro level approaches tend to see labor flows as being caught up in the global economy and demands for labor. Inherent in these flows, however, are borders that are governed by sovereign states and laws that dictate their crossing, or attempt to dictate their crossing. While acknowledging that many do argue that the forces of globalization are making international borders futile, increasingly futile, in the context of this labor migration, the borders and the sovereign powers that maintain and police them are far from relevant, I believe. Patricia Danzer has argued that domestic labor migration is in fact an affair between nations, meaning that the flow of labor capital is facilitated by intergovernment negotiations and agreements. The Philippine state has developed a number of government agencies since the 1970s, have developed close partnerships with third-party recruitment agencies in the Philippines to facilitate and regulate the emigration of overseas Filipino workers, which I will be referring to OFWs. Great. So why would a state invest so much in a labor brokerage system? In the case of the Philippines, it's not that hard to see why. Between 2008 and 2011, there were 1.8 million OFWs processed and deployed by the POEA, which is the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency. These are new hires. These are people that went out in 1 year. This doesn't include the number that were already out on contracts, which could range from a couple of months to a few years, and oftentimes if it's a 2-year contract, it can be renewed while they are still abroad. So in 2012, Saudi was the top receiving country of OFWs. The other four were the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Hong Kong, and Qatar. So of a little over 1.4 million, 330,000 OFWs were deployed to Saudi. Furthermore, in 2012, a combined total of 166,000 newly hired household service workers and caregivers were deployed. So the Central Bank of the Philippines estimates that around $25.4 billion was remitted in 2013. And for the last, I think, 10 years, these remittances have made at least 10% of the GDP of the Philippines. And families rely on this. It's a life or death situation often for this, but not always. A lot of times it's just to send family members to school or to live a little more comfortably, but nevertheless, that's a massive influx. And of course, this is in US dollars, which contributes to the I forget the word, foreign exchange, thank you, of the Philippines. So without these massive inflows of capital, the labor market would not be able to absorb the excess labor of these laboring bodies who could not find work. And in a country that in 2003 is estimated about 44% of the urban population lived in slums, that can be quite a problem in terms of social pressure. So in this picture is from 2011, and I think it's an interesting picture. I took this when I was there. You can see, the shanty town there, and immediately beside it, these aren't slums. These are actually quite wealthy residences. But we see that from the downtown, these slums are being increasingly pushed out to the outside. So this is kind of the situation. And of course, as many of us do know, it's the people living in the slums aren't the ones who are actually leaving because they can't afford it. So if you were to add to that pressure, it could create some serious problems for the state. So that, in a word or two, is why the Philippines is so intent on creating this state migratory apparatus. It's far easier to do this than to actually enact any meaningful change in terms of social equality, job access, internal development, which is a whole other question. So to facilitate this much needed industry of labor export, the Philippine state has developed a structural system of agencies and diplomatic missions to identify global labor market needs, facilitate the training and deployment of workers, and regulate labor emigration. So using David Harvey's theory of the spatial temporal fix, James Tyner has argued that a spatial and temporal fix was utilized to ease the population and economic pressure in the Philippines starting around the 1970s, although in this case it was a crisis of accumulation of labor, not capital. To resolve this, Tyner suggests that overseas contract workers have become the sites of capital accumulation. This process is the transformation of labor power into a commodity. In a traditional Marxian analysis, the worker sells his labor to the capitalist in exchange for a living wage, which in turn is put back into the market. Under the state migratory apparatus, the government sells the labor power of its excess population abroad. In 1974, after President Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines declared martial law, the existing agencies controlling labor migration were merged into the Philippine Overseas Employment Agency, which today is part of the Department of Labor and Employment. These are pictures I found online from a blog. This is kind of what it looks like for an overseas worker. And this particular blog, we can see from the title of the web link, you know, it's a certificate drama. This is what they have to go through, hours of waits to get certified. So despite the system, it still is clogged up. So initially, the POEA, the employment agency, took a very hands-on approach to labor immigration until the highly publicized execution of Flor Contemplacio, who was an OFW in Singapore in 1995. She was accused of murder. Charges were almost definitely trumped up, and she probably took the fall for her employer, who I believe it was another domestic worker who was killed. So after this and the loud criticism that accompanied the Philippines' failure to protect their citizen abroad, the POEA took a step back, and it deregulated this process. So whereas before it took charge in finding workers, placements, and all that, they gave it to the private agencies. And this kind of fits within the neoliberal structure of government employment strategy. So since 1995, the actual recruitment has been conducted by these private agencies. The POEA has a role of authorizing these flows through training and documenting migrants, and engages in intense market research to identify potential labor markets. This role is necessary to maintain a system, a strong sense of trust between the nations. You know, the receiving country wants to know the domestics that they're getting are trained, they're healthy, and furthermore that they're going to do the job. So this trust is built by three functions of the state. The first is to offer programs which will train workers in the profession they will be engaged in. So if we're familiar with the live-in caregiver program in Canada, domestics are required to not only have a grade 12 education, but a 6-month training program, and this is what that role is. The second is to assure the receiving countries of the moral character of Filipino workers through background checks, through police checks. And then the third is to verify the health of overseas Filipinos. And this is for all workers who are going overseas, not just domestics. So this would include like men who are going to work on seafaring ships, machinery workers, everybody. So as with any commodity, The Filipino laborers are marketed with a specific brand which will attract potential employers. This includes a peculiar racialization of the Filipino by portraying them as fundamentally docile, loyal, and hardworking. Further, the workforce is gendered, with women specifically marketed for traditional gendered jobs such as maids, nannies, or caregivers, and men as seafarers. This discursive creation of workers is discussed by Ana Romina Guevara, who argues that an ethos of labor has been constructed by the SMA, I didn't know I did that, sorry, in the Philippines. Part of the POEA's mission after 1995 has included recasting the Filipino overseas worker as a hero rather than a victim. And part of this discursive structure is very visible. So this is an example of a billboard in Manila, just by the international airport. So those who are coming home are welcome to a sign, "Welcome home to all our seafarers. Thank you for a job well done." Now this is sponsored by, this is a third-party business. I can't make out who the actual business is, but the government takes out large billboards like this, and the past president had taken one out where she was standing with smiling overseas workers saying, thanks for a great job. They have this term, the new heroes. They're the new heroes of the country. So we see the POEA and the SMA, the state migratory apparatus, is grooming these workers. But what of the actual workers? What happens to them? So these three, Sally Ordinario, Ramon Credo, and Elizabeth Batain, were three OFWs who went to China for regular contracts. But just before they left, their contractor said, I need you to carry something for the boss. Bring it to the warehouse, and then they'll give you your job descriptions. And of course, it's not hard to imagine where this is going. It was heroin. And smuggling heroin into China is a capital offense. And the three of them, despite all cries and protests from the Philippine state, they were unfortunately executed. And we can see here in this bottom right picture, there's comparisons being made to floor contemplation. So these are the issues that are facing workers, especially in the top 5 countries where we saw. So I'm running out of time, so we're going to quickly get to the Saudi case. Now, the context was the Philippines wanted better protection. Okay, in Saudi, Filipino workers didn't have any labor protection, any legal protection. So the Philippines made some demands. $400 US minimum monthly wage. Currently, they were being paid $200 or less. Employers must submit the physical location of their residence and actually give a map of their residence so that the employment agencies could see what's the makeup of the house. Open a bank account in the employee's name so that it can be verified that they're being paid on time and what they're supposed to be. Now, Saudi said, well, no, this isn't going to happen. 400 was too much, and they were concerned about the privacy rights of their citizens. So, as I was talking about earlier, they said, okay, fine, we'll close it. We'll hire our own people. So this created a temporary crisis. There was an estimated 18,000 Filipino household workers in Saudi at the time. And what happened to these people is that if their contract expired, there were cases of them being pretty much forced to stay. They were refused exit from the country, and they were forced to stay with their employers. Now, as a sign of how important these remittances and these workers are to the Philippine state, the Foreign Affairs Department became involved. And the Foreign Secretary was involved in negotiations, not just with Saudi Arabia, but with other countries, because they were foreseeing that if this labor market is closed, where can we send our workers? So we see this state apparatus working where they identify ahead of time where is a labor market opening up, and they were claiming that they had enough potential jobs. Whether or not that's true or not, I don't know. So the Secretary of the Foreign Affairs, he stated, we are hardworking, we speak English, and we are quick to learn, and we are very loyal. So these sentiments, they expose some of the discursive ways these workers are constructed. But it was true. It was actually true, because by closing the borders to the Filipino workers and also Indonesian workers, the Saudi government was unable to fulfill the labor market needs for domestic workers. So after 15 months, the Saudi government lifted the ban in October 2012 after agreeing to increase protections for Filipino workers. So most of the concessions were given. Increased minimum pay to $400 monthly, which is doubling what they were guaranteed before, which is decent, but still criticized as not being enough considering the conditions they have to work under. And then something called a standard employment contract, which basically gives you some rights, a day off, a trip home once a year. So after this diplomatic victory for the Philippines, it'd be incorrect to call this a real victory, especially for the OFWs. In the short term, $400 does not really compensate for the labor they have to do and the conditions they have to live in, and this has been pointed out by a migrant rights association, that the diplomatic row between the Philippine and the Saudi government presented an ideal opportunity to focus on actually creating jobs within the Philippines, but it was completely bypassed and all energies were put into foreign policy. So, it's apparent that, the Filipino workers are just kind of stuck in between state affairs. In 2013, there was an incident where the Philippine Coast Guard shot and killed a Taiwanese fisherman, and Taiwan responded by closing the borders to all overseas workers. So, just to end this, it's a broken system and there's a lot of flaws with it, but if the state apparatus that has been constructed and has become infused with foreign policy is actually used to the good of its citizens, I think there's hope for a better, more equitable system, although it is fundamentally broken and change needs to be from within. Thank you.